A stormy evening. Ethan Blake stood in his sprawling penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city below. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the metropolis bathed in a mix of glowing streetlights and the occasional flash of lightning. He watched as heavy rain hammered the glass, the storm intensifying with each passing minute. Ethan's reflection, sharp in his tailored suit, stared back at him. A man who had everything he could want, or at least everything he thought he wanted. His assistant had texted him twice already, reminding him of the critical meeting he had that evening. It was supposed to finalize a multi-million-dollar deal with a group of investors from overseas. This was the kind of meeting that could propel his already successful business to new heights. Normally, Ethan thrived in situations like these, his mind laser-focused on profits, deals, and negotiations. But tonight, something was gnawing at him. He checked his watch again and sighed, grabbing his umbrella from the stand by the door. The rain was relentless, as if the sky was releasing all of its fury in one go. His driver was already waiting downstairs, and Ethan knew he had to leave soon if he was to make it in time. As he descended the elevator, the familiar sense of anticipation began to rise in him. The deal was all that mattered, he told himself. After all, this was his life, the one he'd worked so hard to build. Every decision, every long hour, had been for moments like these. Yet, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that something was missing. The elevator dinged, and the door slid open to reveal the lobby. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, a thick curtain that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. His car was waiting by the curb, the driver standing under an umbrella, ready to usher him into the dry, heated interior. Ethan paused for a moment, just inside the building's entrance, staring at the rain. A sense of déjà vu washed over him, though he couldn't quite place why. His hand tightened around the handle of the umbrella, and he was about to step outside when something caught his eye. Across the street, sitting on the curb, was a figure hunched over in the rain. At first, it was hard to make out through the downpour, but as Ethan squinted, the form became clearer. It was a woman, her thin frame barely visible beneath the drenched clothes clinging to her body. She sat on the cold pavement, holding something close to her chest. As another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, Ethan realized it wasn't just a bundle in her arms. It was a baby. The woman was trying desperately to shield the infant from the rain, her own body acting as a flimsy barrier against the storm. Her hair hung limp and soaked over her face, and her clothes were clearly inadequate for the cold, wet night. The sight of her, crouched there in the pouring rain, was striking, a stark contrast to the warmth and luxury Ethan had just left behind. For a brief moment, Ethan hesitated. His logical mind reminded him that this wasn't his problem. He had somewhere to be, an important deal to close, and the woman was just a stranger, another part of the city's invisible struggles. People like her existed everywhere, and it wasn't his responsibility to fix their problems. And yet, he couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the woman, watching as she shifted her position slightly, as if trying to protect the baby even more from the cold rain. The world around him seemed to fade. The sound of the city's traffic, the urgency of his meeting, even the rain itself. He felt something inside him stir, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Against every instinct, Ethan stepped forward, out into the rain. His driver rushed to meet him with the umbrella, but Ethan waved him off, walking toward the woman instead. The rain soaked through his clothes almost immediately, but he didn't care. As he crossed the street, his heart beat faster. He didn't know what he was going to say, what he could possibly do to help. All he knew was that he couldn't just walk away. Not this time. "Excuse me," he called out softly as he approached. The woman didn't look up at first, her focus still on the baby in her arms. She was shivering, her whole body shaking from the cold. Ethan crouched down beside her, his presence finally catching her attention. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. Her face was pale, and the lines of stress were etched deeply into her features. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle but firm. The woman blinked at him, as if she couldn't quite believe that someone was actually talking to her. I don't know where to go, she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold and perhaps from days without rest. Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't sure what he had expected her to say, but the sheer desperation in her voice took him by surprise. He glanced down at the baby, who was wrapped in a thin blanket, barely protected from the storm. The child's tiny face was scrunched up, asleep but clearly uncomfortable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to pour down around them, soaking them both to the bone. But Ethan no longer cared about his meeting or the deal waiting for him. Something deeper had taken hold of him, something he couldn't ignore. His hand moved to his pocket, almost instinctively, and he pulled out his wallet. Without a second thought, he took out his credit card and extended it toward the woman. "Take this," he said, his voice firmer now. "Go somewhere warm. Get yourself and the baby out of the rain." The woman stared at the card, her eyes widening in disbelief. I can't take that," she stammered, shaking her head as if she didn't trust a moment. "Yes, you can," Ethan insisted. "You need it more than I do." The woman's lip quivered, and for the first time since he had seen her, Ethan saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. Hesitantly, she reached out and took the card, her fingers trembling as she held it. She looked at him with a mix of gratitude and confusion, as if she couldn't understand why a stranger would offer such kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Ethan nodded, his mind still spinning from the decision he had just made. He didn't know what had compelled him to stop to get involved in her life, but he knew, deep down, that it had been the right choice. Something about this woman and her child had shaken him out of the bubble he lived in, a bubble of wealth, success, and self-centeredness. As Ethan stood up, he glanced back at his car, where his driver was waiting patiently under the umbrella. The meeting he had been so focused on seemed distant now, unimportant in the grand scheme of things. Without another word, he reached out and helped the woman to her feet. Together, they walked toward the warmth of his waiting car, the rain still falling heavily around them. Ethan helped the woman into the back seat of his car, the rain still pounding around them as if the storm had no intention of letting up. His driver, Henry, a quiet man who had been with Ethan for years, looked surprised but said nothing. He merely held the door open, his eyes flicking between Ethan and the shivering woman with the baby. Ethan slid in beside her, his mind already racing, trying to figure out what to do next. The woman clutched the baby tightly to her chest, her hands trembling as she tried to calm herself. Her clothes were soaked through, sticking to her thin frame, and her face was pale. Whether from the cold or exhaustion, Ethan wasn't sure. The baby, swaddled in a damp blanket, whimpered softly, the faint sound barely audible over the rain hitting the roof of the car. Ethan could feel the tension in the small space between them. She was frightened, probably suspicious, and had every right to be. After all, how often does a stranger, especially a well-dressed businessman, stop to help someone in her situation? But as he glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, he realized she wasn't just scared. She was desperate. "Do you have a name?" Ethan asked gently, breaking the silence. He figured it was the least invasive question he could ask for now, and it might help her feel more at ease. She hesitated, clutching the baby even closer, as if protecting her from the world. Finally, she spoke, her voice small but steady. "Grace." Ethan nodded, sensing that it took effort for her to answer. "And your baby?" A small smile flickered across her face as she looked down at the child in her arms. "Her name is Emma," she whispered, her tone softening for the first time. There was love in her voice, a fierce protectiveness that cut through the fatigue. Emma, a tiny baby, barely older than a few days, wrapped in a fraying blanket in the middle of a storm. The thought stirred something deep within Ethan, a feeling that he hadn't experienced in a long time, if ever. He looked at the fragile bundle in Grace's arms and knew, without question, that they needed more help than he could offer in just a single gesture. Ethan cleared his throat and turned toward Henry. "Take us to the nearest hotel," he instructed, his voice firm. It was an impulsive decision, but Ethan knew that Grace and Emma couldn't stay out here. Not in this weather. They needed shelter, warmth, and care. The business meeting could wait. Henry raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. He had driven Ethan long enough to know that when his boss made up his mind, there was no use in questioning it. He nodded silently, started the car, and merged into the street, the windshield wipers working furiously against the downpour. As the car began to move, Grace shifted uneasily in her seat. "I don't understand," she murmured, her eyes searching Ethan's face for answers. "Why are you doing this? I don't even know you, and you don't owe me anything." Ethan stared out of the window for a moment, watching the rain blur the city lights. Why was he doing this? He wasn't sure if he could fully explain it himself. Something about seeing Grace on that curb, drenched and helpless, with her newborn baby. It had awakened something in him that had long been buried beneath layers of wealth, success, and his own detached existence. He turned back to her, meeting her gaze. "You're right. I don't owe you anything," he said, his voice calm but sincere. "But sometimes it's not about what we owe. It's about what's right. You need help, and I can help. That's all there is to it." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away, blinking them back. She wasn't the type to cry in front of strangers, especially not in front of someone like Ethan, but the sheer weight of her situation, combined with this unexpected act of kindness, was almost too much to bear. I don't even know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. I have nothing to offer." "You don't need to offer me anything," Ethan replied softly. "Just take care of yourself and Emma. That's all I want." The car fell silent again, save for the rhythmic thumping of the rain on the roof. Grace turned her attention back to Emma, gently stroking her tiny face. The baby had finally fallen asleep, her little chest rising and falling in peaceful slumber despite the chaos that surrounded them. Ethan's mind wandered as they drove. He wasn't used to these kinds of situations. He was a man of action, someone who thrived in the world of business, where every decision was calculated and every move was strategic. He didn't deal with emotions, with people's lives on such an intimate level. He had built his empire on rationality and self-reliance, on the belief that everyone was responsible for their own fate. Yet here he was, with a woman and her baby in the back of his luxury car, heading to a hotel to provide shelter for a complete stranger. It wasn't a calculated decision. It wasn't about strategy. It was pure instinct, an impulse born from compassion, a trait he had long suppressed in the cutthroat world he lived in. As the car pulled up to a modest hotel on the edge of the city, Ethan leaned forward. "This place will do," he said quietly. The hotel wasn't grand by any means, but it was clean, warm, and safe. Everything Grace and Emma needed for the night. Henry parked the car, and Ethan stepped out, quickly opening the umbrella to shield Grace and the baby from the rain. She hesitated for a moment, as if still unsure whether she could trust him. But then, seeing no other option and the exhaustion weighing on her, she accepted his help. Together, they walked through the hotel doors and into the small, welcoming lobby. Ethan approached the front desk and booked a suite for the night, handing his credit card to the clerk. Grace stood behind him, holding Emma close, her eyes darting around nervously, as if still half expecting this to be some kind of trick. When the room key was handed over, Ethan turned to her with a reassuring smile. "I'll make sure you're settled in. Then you can rest, and we'll figure out the rest in the morning." Grace nodded, her gratitude evident in her tired eyes. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. It was clear that she was overwhelmed, not just by her circumstances, but by the unexpected kindness of a man she had never met before tonight. As they headed toward the elevator, Ethan felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just an act of charity, something to make himself feel better about his life. No, this was something deeper, a connection to another human being in need, a recognition of her struggle, and a realization that sometimes the right thing to do had nothing to do with profit or success. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside, the quiet hum of the machinery rising as they ascended to the top floor. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. As the elevator doors opened to the suite, Ethan guided Grace inside. The room was warm and spacious, far more comfortable than the wet street where he'd found her. She stood at the threshold, clutching Emma, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Please, make yourself at home," Ethan said softly. Grace hesitated but finally stepped in, setting Emma gently on the bed. Ethan watched, noticing the exhaustion in her movements. She looked like someone who hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. Ethan gave her space, moving to the window and watching the rain continue to pour. After a few minutes, Grace broke the silence. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along," she said quietly, her eyes still on her baby. "I was starting to think there was no hope left." "You don't have to explain anything to me," Ethan replied gently. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Grace shook her head, her voice faltering. "I feel like I owe you an explanation. You've done so much, and you don't even know why I'm here." Ethan stayed quiet, letting her continue. "A few months ago, things were fine. My husband, James, and I had a small apartment. He worked hard, and we were getting by. Then he died in a car crash, and everything fell apart. I lost the apartment, couldn't keep up with the bills, and now here I am, trying to keep my daughter safe." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. Ethan could hear the weight of her struggle in every word. "I've been in shelters, but they're overcrowded. I was running out of options." Ethan's heart clenched. He hadn't realized the depth of her pain when he'd first seen her. Now, the full extent of her loss and desperation hit him hard. "I'm so sorry, Grace," he said, his voice thick with empathy. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Grace nodded, looking at him with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "I didn't expect anyone to help me. People like you don't see people like me." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. She was right. He had been so consumed by his own world that he rarely considered the struggles of others. But seeing her now, he realized how disconnected he'd been. "I've been wrong about a lot of things," he admitted quietly. "But you're not lost, Grace. Not anymore." Grace's eyes softened, a flicker of hope shining through her exhaustion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice small. "You didn't have to stop." Ethan paused, thinking. "I think I've been so focused on my own success that I forgot there are people out there who need help. And tonight, I couldn't just walk away." Grace looked down at Emma, a faint smile appearing. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what's next, but thank you." "You don't have to worry about that now," Ethan said, returning her smile. "We'll figure it out one step at a time." As Grace gazed at her sleeping baby, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Helping her wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a reminder of the compassion he had long ignored, buried beneath his pursuit of success. He realized at that moment that his life had already begun to change. Morning sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting a soft, golden hue across the hotel room. Ethan stirred on the couch, his eyes slowly adjusting to the unfamiliar surroundings. For a brief moment, he was disoriented, but then the events of the previous night flooded back. Grace, Emma, the rain, and the unexpected change of heart he had experienced. He glanced over at the bed, where Grace lay curled up beside her newborn daughter, Emma. The baby was still fast asleep, her tiny body rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Grace looked more peaceful than she had the night before, her face softened by rest. The exhaustion that had once etched every corner of her face seemed to have lifted, if only slightly. Ethan sat up quietly, careful not to wake them. He moved into the sitting area of the suite and poured himself a cup of coffee from the tray that had been left by room service. The rich aroma filled the air, but his thoughts were elsewhere. What now? What had started as a spontaneous act of compassion was now becoming something much bigger. Grace and Emma needed more than just a hotel room for one night. They needed a solution, a long-term solution. Ethan had offered to help them, but he hadn't yet figured out how he would do it. He had the resources, sure, but this was about more than just writing a check. He wanted to make sure Grace and her daughter had a real chance to rebuild their lives. As he sipped his coffee, he began to think like the businessman he was. His success had come from solving problems, seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. Grace was strong, resilient. He had seen that last night. What she needed was a path, a way forward. The sound of movement drew Ethan's attention. Grace was waking up, gently shifting beside Emma. She sat up slowly, blinking at the unfamiliar surroundings before her gaze landed on Ethan. Her expression was a mix of gratitude and uncertainty, a silent question lingering in her eyes. "What now?" "Good morning." Ethan greeted her with a soft smile, standing up as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. "How did you sleep?" Grace rubbed her eyes, stifling a yawn. "Better than I have I don't even know how long," she admitted, glancing down at Emma to check on her. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done last night if you hadn't stopped." "You don't need to thank me," Ethan replied, his tone kind but firm. "I meant what I said last night. I want to help you, but not just for a night. You and Emma deserve more than a temporary fix." Grace's face clouded with uncertainty. She looked away, fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. I don't want to be a burden," she said softly, her voice laced with embarrassment. "You've already done so much, and I don't want to take advantage of your kindness." "You're not a burden," Ethan said firmly, stepping closer but keeping his tone gentle. "I'm offering this because I want to. You're not taking advantage of anything, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Grace looked up at him, her expression guarded. Trust wasn't something that came easily to her anymore. After everything she'd been through, James' death, losing her home, trying to survive on the streets, trust felt like a luxury. But there was something about Ethan, something genuine in his eyes. He didn't seem like someone doing this for attention or out of guilt. He seemed to care. "I'll try," she said after a long pause, her voice quiet. "But I don't know where to start. I've been so focused on just getting through the day. I haven't had time to think about tomorrow." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "That's okay. We'll take it one step at a time. The first thing is to find a safe place for you and Emma, something more permanent than this hotel." Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "A place to stay?" she echoed, shaking her head. "I don't even have a job right now. I couldn't possibly afford rent." "I know," Ethan replied, "but I can help with that. I have a property, an apartment that's sitting vacant. You could stay there for as long as you need until you get back on your feet." Grace blinked, clearly taken aback. "Ethan, I can't just take an apartment from you." "You're not taking anything," Ethan assured her. "Consider it a loan, if that makes you feel better. You can pay me back when you're able, but for now, you and Emma need a safe, stable place to live." Grace fell silent, clearly overwhelmed by the offer. She had spent so long fighting to survive, barely scraping by, that the idea of someone genuinely wanting to help felt almost surreal. "I don't know what to say," she whispered finally, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan replied. "Just let me help." Grace nodded slowly, still processing everything. "What about a job?" she asked. "I need to find work. I can't live off your charity forever." "I'll help with that too," Ethan said. "I have connections. I can put you in touch with people who can help. We'll figure something out that works with your schedule, so you can still take care of Emma." For the first time, Grace's face softened into a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. Ethan smiled back. "You're welcome. Now let's get you and Emma ready. We'll check out of here, and I'll show you the apartment." Grace glanced at Emma, still peacefully asleep on the bed, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a beginning, one she hadn't dared to dream of before Ethan had appeared in the rain. The drive to the apartment was quiet. Grace sat in the back seat with Emma in her arms, her eyes flickering between the passing city streets and Ethan, who was focused on the road ahead. The tension in the air was a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. For Grace, this felt like the start of something new, but it also carried the weight of all the unknowns she had been battling for so long. Ethan glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. "We're almost there," he said, trying to ease the silence. Grace gave a small nod, but her hands tightened around Emma. Despite Ethan's generosity, she couldn't shake the feeling of doubt. Was this real? Could she trust this man who, just last night, had been a complete stranger? As they pulled into a quiet neighborhood, Grace's breath caught. The streets were lined with trees, and the buildings had a warmth and familiarity she hadn't felt in ages. Ethan parked in front of a modest, well-kept apartment complex, and the weight of what was happening slowly started to sink in for her. "This is it," Ethan said, getting out and opening the door for her. He led them up a small set of stairs to the second floor, where he unlocked the door to a cozy apartment. The space was simple but inviting, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light and furniture that, while minimal, gave the apartment a comfortable feel. Grace stood frozen at the doorway, unsure of what to say. The apartment was far more than she had expected. She couldn't believe this place would be hers, even temporarily. This is beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan smiled, stepping aside so she could enter. "I hope it's what you need," he said gently. "There's a crib in the bedroom for Emma and the kitchen stocked with essentials. I wanted to make sure you didn't have to worry about anything for a while." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. She hadn't known what to expect when he said he had a place for them, but this was more than she could have imagined. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to," Ethan replied, his tone soft but firm. "This is about giving you a chance to breathe, to figure out what's next. Take your time." Grace walked into the apartment, still holding Emma close. The overwhelming sense of security that washed over her was almost too much to bear. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't worrying about where they would sleep or what tomorrow would bring. "I don't know what to say," Grace said, turning back to Ethan, who was standing by the door, watching her with a warm smile. "You've done so much for us already." Ethan shook his head. "You don't need to say anything right now. Just focus on you and Emma. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Grace looked around the apartment again, taking in every detail. This was the first step in a journey she hadn't thought possible. She had been so used to struggling, so accustomed to the harshness of life, that the kindness Ethan had shown felt almost surreal. But standing there in the warmth of the apartment, with her baby in her arms and Ethan's support behind her, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them after all. A few days had passed since Grace and Emma moved into the apartment. The quiet hum of the city outside felt distant from the calm that now surrounded them. Grace had spent the past mornings watching Emma sleep peacefully in the crib Ethan had arranged for them. Every time she looked around their new home, a sense of gratitude and disbelief washed over her. Ethan hadn't just provided them with a roof over their heads. He had given Grace time to breathe, time to heal, and time to plan for the future. But the question that lingered in her mind was what now? One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Grace opened it to find Ethan standing there, holding a small box. He smiled, offering it to her. "I thought you might need this," he said. Inside the box was a new phone. Grace's eyes widened, surprised. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "I wanted to make sure you had a way to reach out when you need help," Ethan replied, his voice calm, "and to stay connected with the people who can help you move forward." Grace nodded, swallowing back a wave of emotion. She hadn't realized just how much she'd been isolated. Having a phone wasn't just practical. It was another lifeline, a way to rebuild the connections she'd lost. Over the next few days, Ethan kept his promise. He introduced Grace to a few contacts, people who could help her find work, childcare, and financial assistance. He was careful not to overwhelm her, guiding her through each step with patience. Grace found herself slowly rebuilding her confidence. Each small victory felt like a giant step forward. One evening, Grace sat on the couch with Emma, watching as the baby cooed and smiled up at her. For the first time in months, the constant weight of worry that had been pressing down on her shoulders felt lighter. She wasn't completely out of the woods, but she was no longer walking alone. Ethan visited frequently, checking in, but he kept a respectful distance. He wasn't hovering, just supporting. Grace appreciated that. It made it easier for her to accept his help without feeling like a burden. One afternoon, they sat together in the living room, sipping coffee, discussing the future. "I've been thinking about going back to school," Grace admitted shyly. "I didn't finish my degree before I had Emma, and it feels like it's time to think about long-term stability." Ethan nodded, smiling. "That sounds like a great idea. I know a few people who could help you figure out your next steps. You'd be amazing at whatever you choose to do." Grace looked down at her coffee, her heart swelling with hope. I wouldn't be here without you." Ethan shook his head gently. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than you think, Grace. I just happened to be there when you needed a hand." As they talked about future possibilities, Grace realized how far she had come in such a short time. The uncertainty and fear that had ruled her life for so long had started to give way to something new, hope. And while the road ahead would still have its challenges, Grace knew she had the strength to face them. With Emma by her side and the kindness of people like Ethan to remind her of the good in the world. In that moment, she realized that her life wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding, about creating a future where Emma could thrive. And for the first time in a long time, Grace believed it was possible.